Hi, I'm Alec from easierhabits.com, and I coach work-from-home dads in how to design and build their ideal life, one they're proud to model for their kids. And before I forget, there are show notes for each of these episodes down in the description, so you can check that out. I put in tangents or additional details that don't fit in the video. When I interviewed work-from-home dads this year and asked them what they most worried about, what came to everybody's mind immediately, first thing, was some kind of national catastrophe. COVID or the mishandling of COVID, national politics and polarization or civil unrest. All of these things came to mind, and then the fathers checked themselves a little bit and would then think about specifically the things that they had control over. And I want to talk about this a little bit because it is very easy to feel like we are the hostage of big national events that we have no control over. And that brings a lot of stress into our lives. And I think in the seeds of how these fathers reacted in terms of reframing from national crises to the actual worries and things affecting their individual family, there's a lot to unpack there in terms of how we can be more confident and more resilient when the world around us appears to be really crazy. So I'm going to talk about why the world may not be as crazy as it seems, and how you can be more confident in creating good in your own life. When I was studying psychology in the mid-2000s, I came across a phenomenon called the mean world syndrome. This is from case studies based on TV from like 1990s or earlier. And basically what this was the fact that since the news and popular TV dramas included things like violent crime and reported on them at a much higher percentage than other crimes, that people thought violent crime happened more often. This is based on something called the availability heuristic. A heuristic is basically a rule of thumb that your brain uses to organize lots of data quickly, but it doesn't work for every individual case. And the availability heuristic is simply what comes to mind first is deemed most important or most correct. And so since you have the news over-reporting things like murders, for example, and when you think crime, the first thing that comes to mind for crime is murders, then you think that murders happen more often or are more important, are a bigger factor, a bigger influence on our society than they actually are. And you discount the things the crimes that come second to your mind, like theft or vandalism, even if they're much more prevalent in society. This is maybe one of the reasons why a few case studies of people who quit news for an entire year said that was the happiest year of their life. The news brings a lot of negative events into our life in a disproportionate amount. They don't cover happy things, they don't cover positive things, they don't even cover the things that happen the most, they cover the most negative and sensationalized things. And this isn't just entirely on the news, the shoulders of the news media, right? Humans have also a negativity bias. That means that for every one negative thing someone does to us, for example, we need about like 5 or 6 positive experiences with them to balance it out. We focus on the negative. And you see this with YouTubers, right? They might have, dozens of positive comments, but a lot of the times they react to the one negative comment. Negativity carries a lot of weight with us. The news has known this for a long time and has over-reported the negative and sensational events in the nation so that it can capture our attention and capture our money. Now, that's bad enough, and it was bad enough in the 90s. It was affecting people in the 90s, as these studies showed. But one of the problems with today is news media has changed. So reporter Matt Taibbi wrote a book called Hate Inc., which is a really interesting book. I'll link to a YouTube video where he's talking about it below. But he talks about how the business of news has changed. And so before the internet, not only did everybody subscribe to a newspaper, and that was how they got their information because there weren't other sources, but that was also the primary distribution for ads. And when the internet came along, one, people could get their information from other places, but two, there were things like Craigslist where people could go ahead and get their advertise or connect with each other outside of the local newspaper. And that cut the funding and the support for newspapers way down. But at the same time, Matt Taibbi points out, one of the forms of media that was still highly successful was hyper-partisan, super polarized talk shows. And the editors and business people running the magazines and newspapers, they picked up on this, and this slowly creeped its way into the business model to today, where pretty much every newspaper has a lean. A lot of people argue that they lean one particular way, but I think it's pretty fair to say there is almost every single newspaper has a heavy bias. And there are reporters in the industry who have commented this, that basically editors have told them to lean into what their audience wants and have basically suppressed stories that have a more balanced viewpoint or give the counterpoint to a popular narrative. And so whichever way you're leaning left or right in the US, you're going to get in the news, and what filters through social media from the news, you're going to get a very biased point of view, and not just any biased point of view, you're going to get the most negative, most sensationalized biased point of view, until we're at a point with our country where we feel like half of the country is our enemy, they're crazy, they're morons, or they're destroying us, right? And that's not really the truth. That's not really how day-to-day life runs. That is how the news media portrays it, right? Remember, they have a business to get the most sensational events, to get your clicks, to get your attention, so they can get ad revenue or maybe subscriptions. And this is what works for newspapers. All right, but if you go outside and actually interact with people, you won't see nearly the level of hate, nearly the level of outrage that you do in the newspapers. So one example I came across when talking with a coworker, this is in the Bay Area, this is at tech companies, I was coding. One of my coworkers said they had a neighbor who wore a MAGA hat. And this coworker was very liberal. And when we were talking about bias and the news and polarization, this coworker mentioned that they had a lot of negative feelings for their neighbor. And even though their neighbor hadn't done anything, hadn't said a rude word, had just been politely indifferent like most people are as they pass each other in the hallway of the apartment. And so this is an example of how we are now conditioned to believe that life is a lot more aggressive and negative than it is, but a quick reality check with the actual people around you will reveal that even if they're not all going on the same information, they are much more reasonable. They're more willing to listen to a real person when they're talking to a real person, and they are less full of outrage than the media caricatures we're constantly bombarded with. And this isn't just unique to my coworker. I know there is a conservative, or as you would have it, classical liberal pundit, Dave Rubin, who I think does August disconnected completely. And he says it's one of the best times of his life, or one of the happiest, most peaceful times of his life, because all of the hate that's coming to us is largely coming to us via news, social media, negative organizations, and the conversations that we have in person tend to be much more positive. So the number one thing you can do to restore your faith in humanity and maybe have a more accurate picture of how life actually is and how people actually are is to get outside and talk to people. Now, there are COVID concerns right now. It is 2020. If you're at risk, you can stay inside. But just know that the news is not going to be accurate. The news is going to distort things by being hyper-partisan and by showing you the worst, most outrageous thing happening anywhere in the country, rather than, for example, showing you the things that are typical of where you actually live. One thing the news media has to do to be able to bombard you with the most sensationalist news all the time to generate the most outrage and the most clicks is focus on national news. Chances are, wherever you are in the country, there isn't some major injustice going on. There isn't some horrible crisis. You absolutely do have hard things in your life, but the most sensationalist news is very rarely in your hometown. It is some of the time, right? For a couple of towns right now, for a few towns, a handful of towns right now this year, yes, life has been super crazy. But even when I talk to for instance, people in Portland where there are lots of protests, and following the protests, lots of riots, and the picture that you get of those, varies greatly depending on your media outlet. But even in Portland, talking to family there, that they know people who have been affected, but that also isn't their daily life. It's localized downtown in one small area of the greater Portland area. That is not to downplay the disruption that is happening in these localities, but if you'll notice, most of you aren't actually experiencing the things reported on the news. And this is one of the big things you can do to gain your confidence back in humanity and gain your confidence back in your own ability to do good in the world, is to actually zoom in from this big national crisis, constant crisis that the news needs to have to keep you engaged and keep you clicking, down to your actual community. What are the issues that your community is facing, and how can you help? And the reason why this will multiply your ability to do good in the world is, one, you know the issues extremely well, right? From your own lived experience, you're going to be much better informed about these issues than national crises thousands of miles away, national crises in cities thousands of miles away. And two, you're gonna have a lot more common with people trying to solve these issues. The people around you are going to have some shared experience. There will be different viewpoints and different arguments, but it will be a much easier discussion than a national discussion with hundreds of millions of people with very different cultures and backgrounds and economic situations, right? And so that makes it easier. And then three, the other thing that focusing on your local experience, whether that's local politics, local schools, local homeless shelters, or other causes, the other thing that is very helpful is it's so much easier to get a hold of someone who is local rather than somebody who's national, right? So we build up these national figures. For example, the president, who everyone wants to be covering all the time and wants to be contacting, and they're really busy. They don't have a lot of time for us. And I think the big secret that the news doesn't really share is they don't also have a lot of power over us. A lot of the day-to-day things that you live with are either on the state or the local level, right? It's really easy for the news or local politicians, when things aren't going well, to redirect focus from their particular issues to some kind of national crises that's happening elsewhere, right? But they are, if you hold them accountable, they are much more accountable. They are much more easy to get a hold of and much more easy for you to influence. Here is a bit of realism and negativity that I will be honest and inject into this discussion. There are people who have done studies of the legislation passed at a national level. And what they find is that the legislation that is passed has no correlation with what the average person wants. In fact, you have to get above a certain income threshold and become part of the donor class before you really get to a place where you can start to influence national politics. You have to be able to donate a lot of money or hire lobbyists. All of these things are things that make it harder for you to have a national impact. All right, and I will come back to what our responsibility is on a national level. I'm not saying, don't vote or be involved in national politics or hold our national politicians accountable. Obviously, we want to do that to the best of our abilities. But one of the things that I noticed from these stay-at-home dads as I interviewed them, especially the ones that felt positive about their lives and where their family was headed, was that they redirected their attention from these national crises that are the talking place, are the talking point of the entire country in news and social media. They redirected their attention to what was actually affecting their family, and they thought about that. And we can do the same thing, all right? It's fine to vote, it's fine to participate, it's okay to listen to the news, although just recognize you will be more depressed listening to the news than you would if you were listening to an accurate depiction of the world. You can do those things, but don't spend all your time in an area where you don't have a lot of control. Bring your focus down, and the smaller you bring your focus, the more good I believe you are able to do, and then you can scale that good up when you have the skills to create change. So, for example, just as a thought experiment, let's think about how different would the world be if we just talked constantly about national crises. How much better would the world get? Well, we're kind of seeing the outcome of that, right? Whole lot of talking, protesting, shouting at each other about national issues. And is the world improving for the better because of it? Well, not really. And that's because good things don't happen without daily hard work, right? And so if you flip that around and think, how much better would the world be if everyone just spent an hour of their week helping somebody else in their favorite local cause, right? Feeding the homeless, or creating greater diversity and inclusion, or creating better economic situations, helping your local environment. And then that has a few effects. One, as you do that and interact with real people, not caricatures in the media, you will become more persuasive. Your ability to do more good will increase, and your voice will carry louder because you will start to build networks of people beyond your local area, and you'll have a greater reach for the greater good. Also, if you actually practice changing the world, not just talking about changing the world, or what theoretically would happen if you change the world, or what would happen if we had the right president in place or the right Congress in place, if you actually spend your time experimenting with the things that create change in causes that matter to you, then you'll have really good solutions that you can then take to a national level or share with other locations and see if they will adopt them. If you can show evidence that you are creating a better world, that's really persuasive than trying to shout at people that you need the right president to happen and this amount of money with zero oversight and transparency in government is somehow going to change the world. In fact, I would be very skeptical of people who are telling you you don't have to work to change the world. Just give me money and no accountability and I'll change it for you. Or just yell at the people we want you to yell at and the world will change. Or just post this thing on social media and the world will change. The world is not going to change unless people start doing different things. It's really great for political parties. It's really great for the media to keep us in a state of constant panic so that we can keep giving them money and they can do whatever they want to do. But if you want to exert control over the world, well, start small and grow that, right? If you don't think you can, if you have the control you want over national politics, over hundreds of millions of people in different situations, and with the weight of entrenched media and political parties in front of you, if you don't feel like you have the capability to change that, you don't have to sit helplessly watching the TV and feeling like a pawn in a chess game. Remember, all of these people are regular people. Even the president has to eat and sleep and go to the bathroom, right? They're regular people. They're ignorant and corruptible, just like we are. And to some extent, we've built up this huge investment in nations and states, which are kind of abstract. You can't live in a state or a nation, for example, in the same way you live in your city, that you see all of the world around you and you know the people and you interact. That's a very different experience. And if you want to build up the strength to change the world, start there. It is much more knowable. The problems are still big and still life-changing for the people affected by them. And so start there. And that is a great way. And start with your family. That's kind of what these fathers were doing. They're saying, wait, there's these national things I'm worried about, but I can't really do anything about them. So I'm going to focus on what I can do for my family, which is a great place to start. And from there, bring that out to your neighborhood, your community, and improve the world around you. You can make a change. And I promise you, when you start to see people's lives changing for the better, it will completely change your perspective on what is possible for you to do, what is meaningful for you to do, and how real these reports of national crises on the news are. So if you're feeling helpless, if you're feeling stressed, if the outcome of this election, which hasn't happened yet while I'm filming, if that's stressful and you're frustrated, even if you got your candidate in place, it's probably not your ideal candidate. Relax, take a deep breath. The world is not as bad as the news is making it seem. And there are places where you can do good. Keep doing good, and you will be able to scale that effort and affect a larger and broader community. But if you try to start with just constantly being involved in national politics, you're going to feel helpless. All right? So it kind of boils down to what I sign off with every week, which is Make big changes, one habit at a time. If you liked this video, go ahead and click like or subscribe down below. And of course, if you and your friends and people you know are really stressing about politics, share this video or find some other bit of positivity in the world to share, right? I do my own, fair share of sharing controversy. I'm trying a little bit more to post some things that help people remember the good that is happening in the world. That can be for some people this video if you find it inspiring, but it's fine. Find something and share a little joy with your friends. Don't just pass on the stress. Remember, you don't have to be a hostage to the fear and outrage that the media needs to have for its business model. Until next week, make big changes, one small habit at a time.